Hi there fellow primates, welcome to my video. I hope it finds you well on this slightly overcast Friday. I hope you've all had a good week so far. I had a good week. I've spent most of my week working on a new research grant proposal to do venom research, and I also spent a lot of time examining a thesis and doing in the end a remote viva via Zoom. It had been planned originally to be in person, then a hybrid of in person and digital and remote, and then some of the committee members got COVID or their families got COVID, and so in the end we all stayed at home in our own bedrooms talking to each other from different countries. So that's the new normality. I hope this is one of the last times that we have to do it this way, but who knows. Good thing happened as well though. I got an email on Wednesday from my editor at Cambridge University Press and says, Ron, good news, we've got a final design for the cover of your upcoming book. And ta-da, here it is. Ancestors in Evolutionary Biology, Linear Thinking about Branching Trees. Now, this book is going to be published in the special volume series of the Systematics Association. If you don't know what that is a charity aimed at furthering research in systematic biology. So the royalties will go to them to help promote the field of systematic biology. And this book was written for biologists, for students and professionals, for paleontologists as well as people with a real interest in the history and philosophy of biology. Now, the title covers the load perfectly well, but it was not the first title that I came up with, nor was it the last one that I preferred. The last one that I had come up with was Telling Evolutionary Stories, because that's what the book is about. It's the history of attempts by scientists to tell evolutionary stories to explain the origin and evolution of traits and taxa. But Cambridge University Press is of course a very serious press. It's an academic press, and they said, no, telling evolutionary stories, what does that really mean? Why don't we stick with something serious and something academic like ancestors in evolutionary biology? Everybody knows what that means, and they're right, covers the load perfectly. So this is the title and this is the cover design, and I really quite like it. This is now for the first time a real bit of evidence that this is not just in my head. There is a real concrete existence to this book. Now, I thought, since we have got a cover now, and you can even pre-order the book if you are really impatient on Amazon, I thought maybe this is a good opportunity to give you a sneak preview of the book. Now, I don't know if you are watching this Kagana and Rose, this book is not for you. I don't think this is a book that is for, it's not intended for a lay audience. By all means, if you want to read it, go ahead. But it is really a book designed for people with a deep, nerdy interest in biology, which I suppose, which I expect most of the viewers of this video will be. So without further ado, let's just do a very quick dance through the different chapters, of which there are 12, to give you a taste of what it's going to be like. First chapter, titled A History of Narrative Phylogenetics. And I came up with the term narrative phylogenetics because that covers exactly what the book is about. It is about the science that originated late in the 19th century that takes a narrative storytelling approach to understanding how organisms have evolved over time, how their traits have originated and diversified in different taxa. So this is what the book is about. And I start with a little anecdote. This bearded man here is Professor Michael Lynch. He's a population biologist from Arizona State University. And he wrote in the top journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the USA, an article in which he took on Evo-Devo researcher Sean Carroll, another bearded man. And Sean Carroll was really concerned with the abysmal understanding of evolutionary biology in the general public. So he said, well, to make evolutionary biology a bit more palatable, the teaching of it for educational audiences, why don't we move away from the dry calculus of population biology and instead talk about the evolution of animal body plan and tell that story? Mike Lynch didn't like that. He said, Sean Carroll, and Sean Carroll is an eminent biologist as well, you're completely wrong, fundamentally wrong. Evolutionary biology is not a storytelling exercise. Well, Mike, you are wrong, because evolutionary biology is precisely that. And my book tells you why and how that is. So that was the starting anecdote of the book. As you will see in the last chapter, I end with the silly quote of another Mike, but we will come to that in a second. So that's what the book is going to be about. Second chapter, From Archetypes to Ancestors. You need to begin somewhere. And before evolutionary biology originated, before an evolutionary worldview emerged, people did comparative biology. They compared organisms. They wanted to know how they were related to each other. They wanted to know what the unity was that they saw underlying the surface diversity of nature, like you can see here. These are some shapes of leaves of a single stem of the meadow buttercup. So you can see here that there is this unity underlying surface diversity. And this chapter traces this in the thinking of pre-evolutionists. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, famous poet as well, in Germany, Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire in France. He is lovingly called Mr. Jalfrezi by my wife Sarah here. Thirdly, Richard Owen in Britain, and a little treatment of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in France as well, exploring how they thought about what they called archetypes, the unity underlying the diversity of nature, and how then Charles Darwin specifically transformed these ideas and thought, no, these are archetypes, abstract patterns we see actually point to flesh and blood ancestors, creatures that once lived sometime, somewhere on Earth, real ancestors. And with that, he, of course, planted the flag for the beginning of evolutionary biology. So that's the story that I trace in this chapter. Also try to explode a modern myth. If you're a biologist and you're watching this, you probably think that you know that Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire said, well, if you compare a vertebrate and an arthropod, if you turn one upside down, you turn it 180 degrees, then they become corresponding. You know, the dorsal surface of chordates and vertebrates is homologous, corresponds to the ventral belly surface of arthropods. Wrong. Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire never said that, even though in the literature there has been consensus for decades. So that's a little myth that I try to explode. Third chapter, the emergence of lineage thinking. And that's another new term I coined. I didn't coin a lot of new terms in this book, just narrative phylogenetics and lineage thinking. And lineage thinking is the type of thinking all biologists use when they try to understand, when they try to visualize with their mind's eye how body plans have evolved over time, thinking about invisible processes of transformation and these invisible entities, hypothetical ancestors that must once have existed, but which are empirically inaccessible today. And in this chapter I trace the transformation of a non-evolutionary comparative biology to a comparative biology that is imbued with the metaphysics of evolution. And this particular picture shows you one aspect of this transformation. These are two images of the relationships of major groups of animals. The one on the left is from 1859, the one on the right is from 1870, and they both come from different editions from one book by the comparative morphologist Carl Gegenbauer. He was at the University of Jena, and he was one of the founders, alongside with Ernst Haeckel, of what came to be known as the discipline of evolutionary morphology. They tried to do comparative morphology and try to understand how that reflected the products of an evolutionary process. So the diagram on the left was Gegenbauer's diagram before he had become an evolutionist. So, you know, you see here the tangles of character conflicts. For instance, mollusks look in some ways like worms, vermis, in some ways like vertebrates, and you know, they also have some similarities to protozoans, but sort of a tangle of affinities, as they were called. But then 11 years later, he redrew this diagram like this, like an evolutionary tree, with a time axis from the bottom to the top, that you went from protozoans to worms, and then, for instance, to echinoderms, linear lineages of hypothetical ancestors. Hence, lineage thinking had been introduced in his thinking. It doesn't mean that he suddenly had better tools to create trees out of the tangles of conflicting character data. He redrew this tree because it was in line with theoretical dictates of adhering to the Darwinian theory of evolution. So in this chapter, I really look at how theoretical commitments change the views of systematists in how to draw diagrams that relate their organisms, and of course, in doing so, providing storylines, pathways along which you can relate how evolution happened, in this case on the tree on the right, from the bottom to the top to one of the terminal taxa. Now, the greatest storyteller of all, and also the first one, he founded the discipline, was of course Ernst Haeckel, and he is the topic of chapter 4 titled Ernst Haeckel's Evolutionary Storytelling. He, in the late 19th century, came up with the word phylogeny, as he did with the word ecology, as he did with the word metazoa, as he did with the word bilateria, etc., etc., etc. He was one of the most influential but also controversial figures in biology. He was the person who probably in the late 19th century and early 20th century spread the word of evolutionism wider and further than even Charles Darwin's own writings did. And in this photo you see Mr. Ernst Haeckel standing there with his cousin and wife, same person, Anna Sette. They had a very happy marriage, but it was also very short. Sadly, she died at the tender age of 29. It was tragic. He was so devastated that he jumped into his work, and after a year of monomaniacal writing, he produced a 2-volume, 1,000-page work called Generelle Morphologie der Organisms, the general morphology of organisms. This was the book in which he transformed pre-evolutionary comparative morphology into an evolutionary science dedicated to tracing the phylogenetic origins of characters and taxa. And of course, if you're not a biologist, you probably mostly know Ernst Haeckel, if you know him at all, from his glorious art, as you can see here, these beautiful jellyfish. The one in the middle, the very large one, he called Desmonema anacethi, named after his poor late wife. And another famous image of him is this tree here, from his book Anthropogeny, a book about the evolutionary origins of humans. And you can see in this tree that humans are perched right on the top, subtended by this thick trunk, and all the labels along the trunk are the hypothetical ancestors along which that must have existed along the evolutionary lineage leading up to humans, and then these frilly branches along the side. Now, a tree like this, many modern commentators have decided, this is not really a Darwinian tree. This is pretty un-Darwinian. Why? Well, all the information is in this straight trunk to the top. It looks like the side branches. They have just been put on as an ornament. This is actually not really a Darwinian fully branching tree in every direction. This is just a scala naturae, the old-fashioned lineage, or sorry, ladder of life, the static ladder of life, from simple creatures to humans at the apex. And so it's not really Darwinian. It's just a transformation of an old-fashioned view. I spent a lot of time and ink in this chapter saying that that is a complete misinterpretation of Haeckel's trees, because the linearity in his trees is not a scala naturae. It is just the lineages of hypothetical ancestors that underpin the existing diversity of biology. Any organism living and extinct can be traced back in evolution through these linear lineages to common ancestors. By linear I mean simply that these lineages trace the arrow evolutionary time. And he was a lineage thinker, the first one. He wasn't conceptually the best person. I mean, he was the first. A lot of improvements needed to happen, and in subsequent work, systematists and morphologists, fine-tuned a lot of his concepts. But this is not a tree that is basically just a dressed up old-fashioned view of things. This is a real revolutionarily new way of looking at the evolution of creatures. I should hurry up. I shouldn't talk forever about Haeckel, although I can. Chapter 5, the epistemic rise of hypothetical ancestors. And this chapter really explores how scenarios, evolutionary scenarios, were constructed by biologists. And there it was all about tracing traits that you want to explain the origin of, like, for instance, the pituitary gland that is in your brain, to precursors that must have been present in hypothetical ancestors. And if you look at this scenario, it's infamous, some of you may recognize this. William Patton tried to derive vertebrates from arthropod ancestors, from crustacean and arachnid ancestors, and he derived the pituitary, for instance, from an excretory structure in arachnid ancestors. The principle there is, if you want to explain the phylogenetic origins of taxa and traits, you cannot allow de novo origins of traits. You always need to be able to trace something back to something observable earlier in an evolutionary lineage, because otherwise phylogenetic morphology, evolutionary biology, cannot have explanatory power. It resides entirely in being able to trace stuff back to precursors in hypothetical ancestors. So that's what this chapter explores, the power of this assumption that no true novelty can exist and how biologists and paleontologists work with that. Chapter 6, Intuiting Evolution. Of course, for most of the history, certainly of pre-molecular evolutionary biology, evidence for evolution was super fragmentary. Yes, of course, fossils are the only direct bits of evidence of the evolutionary past, but always fragmentary. It's a pretty scarce buffet of evidence. So a lot of evolutionary scenarios were built with a very biased ratio of facts and fantasy. A lot of intuition, a lot of speculation and arm waving was involved. And one of the examples here is, for instance, and this comes from a book from 1990, Pat Wilmer, an author, she decided, well, how did mollusks originate from, say, a flatworm-like ancestor? And she used words like, well, the steps that can be predicted, like, well, they became a little larger, they evolved the dorsal shell, and then if they have that, they have to grow out little respiratory surfaces, and etc., etc. And it was almost like a deductive inference from when the first step happens, then the rest automatically follows. Where I don't know if it happened like that. She didn't know either, but for her that was an intuitive scenario based upon how she felt evolutionary change probably plausibly happened. This book was reviewed in 1990 in the journal Cladistics by Kirk Fitzhugh, a polykid worker, and he was a real asshole. He called his review Invertebrates and Ignorance, the book, which is an unkind dig at this book. It was still a very interesting book, even though she didn't come to a great conclusion, but an interesting book about how biologists and paleontologists use their imagination to try to see sense in the chaos of data that we are presented with. So that chapter is all about intuition as an ingredient in evolutionary speculations. Let's go to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is called Telling Straight Stories with Fossils, and there I take a detailed look at how paleontologists lined up evidence in smooth morphological gradients to tell stories about evolution. Sometimes they use stratigraphy as a guide, you know, all the fossils at the bottom, intermediate fossils in the middle, the youngest fossils at the top, to try to understand these lineages of hypothetical ancestors. And one indication of this, and they did that with living creatures as well, is by a guy called Bashford Dean. He was actually, I don't think a paleontologist, but he was an orthogeneticist. He took this extreme, this tactic of lining up evidence along smooth morphological gradients to an extreme. And here, this is an example. He was a fish expert of the egg capsules of ghost sharks, chimeras. And you can see here that he just lined them up in this smooth gradient. The one on the left is actually a hypothetical ancestral form, and the one on the far right is what he predicted would be found in the future, which is a hypothetical terminal sort of extreme form. So it is just looking at stuff, arranging stuff in nice linear patterns, nice smooth transitions, and then you said, well, this clearly is probably how evolution happened in a gradual way. Bashford Dean is an interesting guy. He lived in the early 20th century. He was a curator of fishes at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and at the same time also a curator of ancient armor and armory at the Metropolitan Museum. He was an expert in both these different fields. Interesting character. So this chapter looks really at how paleontologists line up fossil evidence. I also look at the debate between Franz Hilgendorf and Alpheus Hyatt about the famous fossil snails from the Steinheim basin in Germany, where Hilgendorf used these fossils to build what is considered to be one of the very first Darwinian branching diagrams of fossil lineages, and Alpheus Hyatt, being an orthogeneticist, saying, no, there's no tree in these snails, they're just linear lineages that run up in parallel. And I analyzed this debate between them to answer the question, who was right? What was a better way to try to reconstruct evolution? Chapter 8, Seeing Animal Ancestors in Embryos. And this is a chapter that looks at the most enduring, controversial, influential phylogenetic scenario of all, which is depicted here in this little diagram. Of course, the Gastria theory, by Ernst Haeckel. He coined it in 1872. So this year, 50th anniversary of the Gastria theory, hip hip hooray Ernst, and it became the basis of a scenario of body plan evolution that to this day can be found in the primary literature to provide context for current debates. And this chapter looks at his hypothesis and how his contemporaries come up with competing hypotheses. Elie Metchnikoff from Russia, Otto Bützli from Germany, and Francis Maitland-Balfour from the UK, all looking at different bits of fragmentary evidence and coming up with their own scenarios. So this was one of the first intensely debated scenarios of animal body plan evolution. That's what this chapter is about. Getting to chapter 9, titled Ancestral Attractions in Phylogenetic Folklore, and there I look at some of the traits that hypothetical ancestors have and that are very attractive to different authors at different times. And one of them has to do with annelids, these segmented worms, being extremely attractive as hypothetical ancestors for understanding the evolution of many different things, but also a character that was called EMSTEMI in the 1990s, which is simply, if you look at an embryo, you may have an embryo where the little gut has invaginated, and you get an opening into the gut that is like a slit, and at the front end it pinches off a mouth, and at the hind end an anus. So you get from one slit-like opening into the embryo a mouth and an anus. And arguments could be said that, well, this is actually how it happened in evolution. So this is a drawing here from 1884 by Adam Sedgwick, a student and former pupil of Francis Maitland-Balfour, and he draws a sort of sea anemone-like creature, and this is a cross-section, where you can see in the middle this slit-like opening into its gut. And he said in evolution what happened is that a creature like this just closed its gut and made a tube out of it with an opening in the front and an opening in the back. That is called EMSTEMI, when both mouth and anus come from one slit-like opening. And this evolutionary hypothesis became the golden thread in a whole tradition of evolutionary scenarios in Europe. And this story, the weird story of EMSTEMI, is what I tell in this chapter. It's weird because it is debated up to this day that some people say, well, yeah, an EMSTEMIC ancestor, pretty much like this sort of sea anemone-like thing. If you look through your fingers, is what really happened. And other people say, there's not a shred of evidence for it. Interesting. So that's a thing I take a look at. Chapter 10, Narrative Shortcuts and Phylogenetic Faux Pas. So even today, when we have sophisticated methods of doing comparative research and on the basis of evolutionary trees carefully reconstruct ancestral states and have a evolutionary inference guided by trees of relationships of the relevant organisms, people still cannot suppress their evolutionary intuition. So there's still a lot of often very speculative storytelling going on in today's literature, if only when it is to judge whether trees they have reconstructed with objective methods are believable or not. But you also get people trying to, I guess, shape the evidence in favor of their preferred hypothesis. Like a tree like this was published in the late 1990s. On the basis of this tree, it was concluded that bilaterians had coeloms, probably segments as well, and that therefore platyhelminths, flatworms, in the little square in the square box here, lost in evolution coeloms and segmentation. You go, yeah, that's very convincing, except 1/3 of the animal phyla, almost all of which don't have coeloms and don't have segmentation, were not put in this tree. Why not? So this is just a shortcut, a storytelling shortcut to try to convince people that there is support in the comparative framework for your hypothesis, where you have just actually reheated the assumptions and presented them anew as conclusions. And this chapter argues that that happens a lot, that assumptions play an important role still in modern debates. Getting towards the end, penultimate chapter, TAXIC, distortions of lineage thinking. And this is where I look in detail at that sort of tension between thinking about evolution of animals in particular as linear lineages, as hypothetical ancestors through time, through a tree, and then looking at the relationships of the collateral relatives in an evolutionary tree as being a realm of branching. So that tension between linear thinking and branching thinking, I look at that carefully in this chapter. And then I find that my former hero, Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, a paleontologist, popular science writer from Harvard University, got this completely wrong. He, for instance, looking at an image like this, a linear march of evolution, thought that this type of iconography was completely bad, and it misled everybody into thinking, no, evolution isn't linear, it's branching, it should be a branching tree. This is a very misleading image of evolution. And look online, look in articles, look in books today, you can find a lot of people who say exactly the same thing, and they're all wrong. There's no labels on this figure, but at heart, evolution, and if you ignore the fusion of lineages, like happens when you have hybridization or symbionts, evolution is simply linear change in populations. And if lineages split, well, then you suddenly have two chains that are each of them linear. So as a bare bones image of what evolution is about, this kind of thing is perfectly fine. It's exactly what it could be like. You shouldn't, of course, think that these are living creatures you can line up, because the linearity of descent goes back in time. You can't draw a line of evolution between living collateral relatives. But this is essentially what evolution looks like. Robert O'Hara got it wrong too. Who's Robert O'Hara? Well, he's the guy who in the late 1980s made the term tree thinking famous. It's now ubiquitous in biology. And he also said this kind of imagery is wrong. We shouldn't be telling linear evolutionary stories. Evolutionary history is fundamentally different from normal human history. I don't think so. And the problem with the views of O'Hara and Gould is that they have spread to infected the educational literature, the literature designed specifically for science teachers and what they should tell students and children. So I treat that topic in some detail. And then we come to the final chapter, which I've called Making Sense with Stories. It's just a final meditation. And I end with another Mike. This is Michael Novosek from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He is the Vice President of Science there. And in 2013, he and co-authors published a paper in Science in which they reconstructed the possible body plan of the last common ancestor of all placental mammals, a cute little tree shrew-like creature. And he was interviewed for the LA Times about it, and he said, don't know of anybody else who's ever done that, reconstruct a hypothetical ancestor like this. And I was like, really? This would even be a strange statement if you had made this statement a century earlier, because the entire history of evolutionary biology is all about the nature of hypothetical ancestors. Their tiny hypothetical shoulders carry all the explanatory power of phylogenetic hypotheses to explain the origin and evolution of traits and taxa. So has nothing changed? Is storytelling still around? Yes, it does. It has changed. And one of the strong changes is that a lot of the storytelling that happens today are not stories told by humans, and are not told to, to be listened to. And these are stories told by molecular substitution models that we all use to build phylogenetic trees, on the basis of which we can then make inferences about the evolution of the phenotype. And so what you're using is a story about the probable evolution of gene sequences made by a probabilistic model, which you then leverage to tell stories about other traits of the creatures. I find this very strange, and this final chapter I used to explain why that is. And so we come to the end. Now, I wanted this to be a 15-minute sneak preview. At most, it's now 29 minutes. So I was like, ah, man, I'm sorry. It's like for the first time coming out of the house and describing your cute little baby to other people. But still, believe me, this is only a small preview. The book is 450 pages long. It's got 65 illustrations, more than 1,000 references. So there's a lot more to learn. And for me, then the pandemic was actually, it came at the right time. I was able to put some projects in the fridge and focus without distraction on finishing this project, which I did. So now I'm very excited to share this with you. I really hope that some of you are going to buy and read it, so we can have interesting discussions about it. I will now shut up because it's more than long enough, too long. I apologize. I'm not going to try to re-record this in a shorter way because I can't. You can't talk in a shorter way about something you're so excited about. Anyway, I wish you a good rest of the week. Have a lovely weekend. I hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye.